Module 1. Welcome to the class. In this class, we will look at leaders in organizations. Our thoughts about what constitutes effective leadership has changed over time. Initially, people believed that leaders were born, and now we understand that effective leadership can be taught, that it is a result of a collection of skills and behaviors. In this class, not only will you learn about leadership, you will also work on a personal leadership improvement plan. Please read the syllabus, taking note of late policies, when deadlines are for both discussions and other assignments. For example, your answers to the discussion questions are to be posted by Wednesday at 11:59 p.m. Central Time each week. All other work is to be finished by Sunday at 11:59 p.m. Central Time each week. You will have a leadership project due week 6. Your choice of movie or book is due week 2. There is a case study where you will be asked to apply what you are learning to the situation due week 5. The case is included in the case study assignment description. Last but not least is your professional development journal. Each week you will complete self-assessments found in the book. Identify your strengths and weaknesses, find a resource that will help you improve one weakness, and then propose how you might use that resource to address that weakness. By the end of the class, you will have 5 ideas for strengthening your leadership skills. If you were to choose to implement these plans at some point in the future, that should help you become a better leader. At the start of the Industrial Revolution, the owner hired a manager and gave them free rein to do whatever needed to be done in order to get the employees to do the work. There were no pre-existing models for owners and managers to follow with respect to how to run these companies. No one was thinking about the implications of leadership and management behaviors. Of course, a century later, we know a great deal about what constitute effective leadership and management of organizations. This video lecture, Evolving Relationship Between Management and Leadership, will set the stage for why and how we look at both leadership and management in modern organizations and companies. In Module 1, you will learn, amongst other things, that management and leadership are not the same thing. For a long time, managers and organizations didn't realize the breadth of skills they needed to be an effective manager, which includes being an effective leader. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, people mostly worked in small family groups. There was no need for managers as we think of them today. There were no large, complex companies and organizations. As a result, when factories started to open, the people who managed these enterprises needed to figure out what to do so that the owners made money. Employees were hired who could be trained to do the work. Employees came to work and then did their jobs properly. What managers slowly discovered was that they needed a broad range of skills. Initially, they were focused on the technical skills needed. Then they realized that managing people required them to have people skills. Eventually, they also discovered that to be effective managers and leaders, how they managed had to be appropriate to the situation, that there was no universal one best way to manage. When you read Chapter 1, you will see the broad range of management and leadership skills that we now know are needed to be effective. It is pretty interesting how we got to this point. As was stated earlier, the Industrial Revolution, which started in the late 1800s, meant that there was now a need to train and supervise a large number of employees. Since the assembly line had been invented as a more efficient way to do a job, this meant that each employee needed to do their job in exactly the same way. Instead of one person building an entire product, now they only did a couple of the steps. We know now this would be boring. There's a danger of repetitive motion injury, etc. But back then, managers weren't worried about that. They were worried about how to most efficiently get the job done so that the owners would make money. This meant that managers needed to figure out how to hire workers who could be trained to do the job and then make sure they did it exactly the same way as quickly and perfectly as possible. This led to training and supervision problems. Because manufacturing exploded, the rapid growth increased managerial problems as managers struggled to keep up with demand, have enough employees who were able to do the job well, oversee everyone, and keep everyone on task. That workers slacked off, that coordination within and between groups was difficult, thus production dropped or quality was uneven as viewed as a productivity problem, not as a motivation, hiring, or training problem. As a result, the first students of management tried to figure out how to solve these production problems. Managers quickly figured out that they needed standard operating processes and procedures. Looking at the history of how people tried to solve management problems, there were four major eras. The first was the classical era, at the start of the Industrial Revolution, which began in the late 1800s. People were viewed as replaceable cogs in the wheel, and there were two problems. The first was how to standardize everything so that how the job was done did not depend on the person doing it. The second was to figure out how to get the task done in the most efficient way possible. The first priority for managers during the Industrial Revolution was to figure out how to organize a factory. At first, there was an owner who hired a manager who then hired the employees. Thus, there were the three levels of hierarchy: owner, manager, worker. When 80 and 100 or more people started working at factories, there was no way a single manager could oversee all of that, so one major task in the classical approach era was to figure out the role of the manager in the formal hierarchy, something which we now represent in an organizational chart. Managers focused on the technical functions and roles in the factory. They struggled to define the task, how people and machines function together, what was the one best way to do the job. The scientific and administrative management approaches were focused on these concerns. The scientific management approach evolved because Frederick Taylor in the early 1900s tried to solve the production problems by using scientific study of the jobs. He was interested in employee efficiency. Eventually, people realized the entire organization and how it functioned mattered, not just the production portion. Managers also started to realize that practices were transferable to many different kinds of organizations. This is called the administrative management approach. The goal of scientific management was to improve the efficiency of employees doing their job. Frederick Taylor, in the first part of the 1900s, studied the movements a worker needed to make to, for example, shovel coal into the furnace. His goal was for workers to do that task using the least number and most efficient way. Once he discovered that then all employees shoveling coal were trained how to do it in exactly that best way. He viewed production problems not as employee-caused problems, for example, being lazy today. Rather, this was a management failing. Management was not paying attention to how the workers were doing their jobs. This lack of attention caused the productivity problems. Taylor's insights were considered innovative and increased production. Because of him, managers believed there was a single best way to do a job or task, that the job of the manager was to find that best way. Not only that, but not all people were suited to do all jobs. The goal then became to figure out what employee characteristics were needed to be able to do the best job. To do that, they needed to test people for those characteristics and then hire only those who passed those tests. Then the manager had to train the employees in the best way to do that job. Employees needed incentive to actually do the work the way they were supposed to do the job. At the time, managers believed that workers were only motivated by money. As a result, they tied pay to doing the job in the way they were trained to do it. As a side note, this was the start of the HR department with respect to hiring employees who were capable of doing the job, not just hiring anyone. In addition, as managers worked to set up a hierarchy in the organization, work was divided between the manager and the employee. The manager managed and the employee did the actual tasks to produce the product. Administrative management evolved from classical management as managers realized that management is a function that went beyond the technical skills of doing the production task. They also realized that management functions were applicable to any organization. The administrative management approach went further than this, as managers realized that the entire organization needed to be coordinated to work together as a unit. Management and researchers still believed that employees were rational in how they approached work and were only motivated by money. For example, if management paid workers more money to work quickly than to work slowly, that they'd want to earn money and so work faster. Of course, we now know that this is not true. Things beside money motivate people to do a good job. The problems they were having motivating employees weren't solved by how money was tied to performing the work. When managers and researchers had this insight, this led to the behavioral approach. The behavioral approaches expanded the responsibilities of managers to start to include the leadership functions and roles. Because of employee unrest, managers realized they needed to do more than try to motivate employees with money. That was not working as well as they had hoped. Managers began to realize that they had to understand that employees had needs beyond earning money. They saw that when they addressed those needs, production increased and employees' attitudes improved. They saw that employee attitudes mattered with respect to production. In short, they realized they needed to understand human behavior. This came about partly because of the Hawthorne studies. Elton Mayo studied workers at Western Electric's Hawthorne plant. He wanted to answer the question, what in the workplace affected employee production? What he found, after varying numerous variables, was that employees needed to feel valued by their managers and by their coworkers. He also discovered that good social relationships were required between coworkers and between employees and managers. Many of our modern leadership theories include leader-follower relationships and emphasize that it matters how followers are treated. At the time, this was considered an important insight and expanded managerial responsibilities. The systems approach took the previous two approaches and integrated them. This approach took things one step further by looking more specifically at how all the parts of the organization fit together. The proponents of this approach understood that organizations are systems with interrelated parts. Managers couldn't just manage one aspect in isolation, rather they needed to manage the entire system as a whole. They also needed to recognize that everyone needed to be working towards a common goal and manage accordingly. One big name in this movement was W. Edward Deming. He focused on the need for an organization to be continuously improving. In this approach, an important focus for managers was on quality. He also used a scientific approach to this, using statistics to improve quality. There could only be, for example, a certain percent of rejected widgets coming off the assembly line. If there were more, then the job of the manager was to figure out why and fix the problem. Because all jobs were part of a larger system, this also meant that no one job was more important than any other job. In the past, manager jobs were considered more important than the employee job. His total quality management system was a pioneering program. Of course, there are now many programs like this. One popular one today is Six Sigma. As people become more sophisticated in how they managed and led organizations, they began to realize that there is no one right way. Instead, it depends on a multitude of factors. In order for a manager or leader to decide they needed to act, they needed to do several things. First, they need to identify what is important, what variables, conditions, etc. mattered in each situation. These variables include the people and their characteristics, not just external to the people variables. They then need to understand how these variables interact with each other and how they depend on each other. Once they understand cause and effect, then and only then can they decide what to do and how to act. For example, if you were managing a brand new employee learning a new job, you'd likely manage them very differently than a high-performing employee who knew the job well. If you treated them both the same, it would be inappropriate for one or the other employee. As a result, performance would drop when the employee was managed inappropriately. Also important was the realization that there were causes and effects of managerial decisions. The goal in contingency approaches is to choose the most appropriate managerial or leadership behavior that has the highest potential to result in the best outcome possible. The contingency approach underpins many current leadership theories, some of which we will study in this class. These historical developments influence current management and leadership thought. The classical and systems approaches both have a heavy focus on the technical functions. Initially, managers didn't differentiate between leadership and management. The initial focus was primarily on the technical functions, roles, and skills of the manager. Modern leadership theory recognizes that it's part of leadership, but that there is also more. Historically, managerial functions and leadership functions weren't discussed as somewhat different concepts. It took the expansion of the management responsibilities for people to begin to see how management and leadership were connected but were also different. When managers realized that employees weren't just cogs in a wheel, that they had needs, wanted to be valued, that social relationships mattered, this served to enlarge the role of the manager. As you will see in this class, this is a critical but not the only component in many management and leadership theories. The behavioral systems and contingency approaches incorporate this idea. Another step forward was taken when it was understood that the decisional roles of a manager also mattered, that decisions that managers were made influenced by conditions around them, and this in turn influenced the system, that is the organization, including the employees. The systems and contingency approaches incorporate this. So how are managers and leaders different? Managers get their power from the position they occupy. This is called position power. Followers, the employees, are required to do what the manager says because the manager has position power. Later in the course, we will talk about power and sources of power. Leaders, on the other hand, get their power from other sources, for example, their expertise. The follower knows that person is an expert, and so when the leader says, do it this way, the follower likely will because they recognize that the person knows what they are talking about. A follower is not required to follow the leader, rather they choose to do so. There usually are informal leaders in organizations. These people are leaders because of their power, but are not in management positions. Of course, the best case is that a leader is in a management position. Then followers want to follow them not just because they have to. Employees then do what the manager says because, to use the same expertise example, respect for the manager's expertise. Of course, in this case, the manager has a backup power source, that which comes from their position, that the informal leader does not have. Usually, managers prefer to use sources of power other than position power to get people to do things. Some of the leadership theories we will study in this class will help explain why this is true. In the beginning, the field of management had a simplistic view of their employees and what it took to be a leader and manage an organization. Today, we realize that management and leadership both require a complex set of skills, and there are many approaches. This class will examine some of them in detail. This information was taken from, and for more information on, the history of management and leadership in management. See the reference listed here.